Bom dia a todos. É uma grande alegria para o Tribunal Regional Federal da Primeira Região, também para o Ministério Público Federal, ver hoje esse auditório tão lotado. Em gentileza ao nosso convidado, que não fala a língua portuguesa, eu e a Luana pedimos licença para nós realizarmos esse painel em língua inglesa. Professor Matthew, I have never seen this auditorium so packed, but I'm sure that the audience here did not come to see Luana and me, but they came here to learn from you and to share experiences with you. I want you to notice that you have here a very selected group of judges, public prosecutors, lawyers, state attorneys, professors, and students. This group is very representative. They are among the best professionals currently working within the Brazilian legal system, most of them in charge of corruption cases. I assure you that all of us are compromised with two non-negotiable values. First, enforcing the constitutional norms and their fundamental rights. And second, making our political institutions more efficient and accountable. This dual focus leads us to the topic, the core of this event, facing corruption in a democratic state of law.
Bom dia. Não tá ligado. Bom dia a todos. When we first thought about holding an event on anti-corruption law, the name of the Professor Matthew naturally came into our minds. He's one of the most prominent academics in the world on anti-corruption law. He studies how the legal systems of different countries face corruption internally, and most recently he has given valuable insights on the fight against corruption in Brazil. He's the author of many articles about the subject and the chief editor of the Global Anti-Corruption blog, where he and others write about policy, law, and social science. So it's a big honor to us to have such a talented and respectful professor here. But above all, it's very emotional, particularly for me, to have you here, Professor. I met Professor Matthew 2 years ago in Harvard. He was my advisor. By that time, I could never imagine that we would be here together to discuss and study such an important issue for our country. Thank you for coming. Thank you for contributing to this subject for our country. Thank you.
It would be absolutely unnecessary, but I'll read a Professor Stephenson's short CV. Matthew Stephenson is professor of law at Harvard Law School, where he teaches administrative law, legislation and regulation, anti-corruption law, and political economy of public law. Professor Stephenson clerked for Justice Anthony Kennedy at the Supreme Court, and he holds a Bachelor's of Arts, a Juris Doctor degree, and a PhD in political science from Harvard University. Professor Stephenson will first deliver a lecture, then he will engage in a broad discussion with the audience in the same Harvard classes style. Thank you, Professor.
How's that? Sound good? All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just delighted to be here, as well as both honored and humbled to have the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm grateful to all of the organizers of this event, from the judiciary, from the Public Prosecution Service, from ESMAF. I'm also grateful to all of you for taking time out of what I know are very busy schedules. I know that all of you have a lot of very important responsibilities, and I, again, am both honored and humbled that you would take time away from your work to come join in this event and listen to my remarks. That said, I should confess that I'm a little bit nervous having to speak to such a distinguished and knowledgeable audience, especially given that my remarks follow immediately the much more insightful and well-informed remarks of some of the leading figures of your prosecutorial and judicial institutions. And I feel like how could I follow that? What could I possibly add to what you've already had the opportunity to hear this morning and what you will be hearing from other Brazilian experts in corruption over the next several days? I'm worried that there's nothing really that I can add that will be of sufficient value, but nonetheless, I was kindly invited, so I feel like I should push ahead and do my best to talk in general terms about what I view as some of the most important issues related to the fight against systemic corruption. Systemic corruption is obviously a big topic in Brazil right now. It's the reason that this event exists and the reason that so many of you are here. I don't intend in my remarks to talk very much specifically about the Brazilian situation or about the current Brazilian efforts against corruption. I don't have sufficient expertise to speak on those topics to an audience like this, and you will be hearing from many more people and have already heard from people who can speak more specifically. That said, if at some point, either after this talk or sometime in the coming days, if people are interested in asking me questions specifically about the Brazilian situation, I will do my best to respond. But in these remarks today, I'd like to speak more generally about what we know based on academic research and a survey of experience in other countries and throughout history about the problem of systemic corruption and what one can do about it. I want in these remarks to touch on four big issues or topics. So first, I want to say a little bit about why tackling systemic corruption is so important. Second, I want to say a little bit about why systemic corruption is such a difficult and sometimes seemingly intractable problem in so many societies. Third, I'll say a little bit about the kinds of legal reforms or legal institutional reforms that might play an important role in the fight against corruption. And fourth and finally, I'll say just a little bit about how, as a political matter, one can try to push ahead, how countries can try to push ahead with successful anti-corruption reforms. In other words, what are the political conditions that are most conducive to or favorable to implementing the kinds of reforms that might get systemic corruption under control? So with that, let me start out with the first of those topics, why reducing systemic corruption should be such a high priority. Now, the idea that any country could eliminate corruption altogether is unrealistic. It's no more realistic to think that we could eliminate corruption than it is to think that we could eliminate violence or theft or drug addiction. These are problems that will always be with all societies to some extent. But nonetheless, it appears to be the case, it is clearly the case, that in some societies, the problem of corruption is systemic. It's so widespread that it pervades the political system, the economic system, and so forth. Whereas in other countries, while corruption is a problem, it's a problem that is more under control, where corrupt behavior, though a problem, is more of the exception than the rule. So the challenge before us is how can we move from a situation in which corruption is pervasive, where it's the rule, to a system where corruption is controlled, where it's the exception. And making that transition is important because corruption has a range of bad effects, many of which are quite familiar to this audience and many of which were discussed quite cogently and forcefully by this morning's speakers. I could fill the entire time elaborating all the various ways in which corruption is bad. I don't want to do that, but I'll just touch on a few of the most important, in some cases re-emphasizing points that you heard from the earlier speakers this morning. First of all, corruption is bad for the economy. It's an economic drag. It discourages investment, both domestic and foreign investment. It stifles innovation. It creates unfair advantages for incumbent firms, discouraging new entrepreneurs or innovators. It can lead to a misallocation of human talent, as the most talented people in society pursue political connections or ways to cultivate favorable deals rather than going into fields where they could have a more productive effect. And it can increase the risks of significant macroeconomic crises. The 1997 Asian financial crisis, though it has very complicated causes and complex roots, is attributed, at least by many, to corruption and cronyism, where the allocation of capital often went to not those who were the best investments, but those who had the best connections, creating a high degree of systemic risk. I want to emphasize this point that corruption is bad for the economy, even though I'm sure it's one that many of you will basically agree with, because it was not always consensus that, at least in developing countries, in poorer countries, that corruption was necessarily economically bad. There was a widespread view, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, but one that persists even in some quarters today, that in a society where there are too many regulations or regulations are inefficient, corruption can actually be a kind of grease in the wheels, is the metaphor that's often used, and it can actually promote economic growth. This idea was nicely captured by one of my teachers in graduate school, the late Professor Samuel Huntington, who once wrote back in the 1960s that in a developing country, the only thing that is worse for growth than a rigid, over-centralized, dishonest bureaucracy is a rigid, over-centralized, honest bureaucracy. By which he meant that when the bureaucracy is rigid and over-centralized, corruption becomes a necessary way to get around inefficient rules. But while it's a clever line, the weight of the academic research suggests that it's not true. It's not the case that corruption always has negative economic consequences. There's a kernel of truth to the point that Professor Huntington was making. But more often than not, corruption functions as a kind of sand in the wheels of the economy rather than grease in the wheels of the economy. And one of the many reasons for this is because the inefficient rules, the excessive bureaucracy, is often the result of corruption. That is one of the reasons that governments don't streamline processes and make it easier to do things like register your business or get a license or what have you, is precisely because those inefficient rules generate more opportunities for extracting bribes. Now, in addition to this sort of sand in the wheels of the economy effect, corruption also can lead to substantial misallocation of public resources and public spending. It also leads to just outright theft of public resources. That's straightforward. But in addition to simply siphoning off resources that the government could be spending on valuable public goods and services, widespread corruption often causes a distortion in the kinds of things that governments choose to spend their money on, in favor of those sorts of spending that increase the opportunities for corruption, as opposed to those sorts of spending that might have the most productive or beneficial effects for society. So, for example, when corruption is very widespread, there's likely to be excessive public spending on the military, as opposed to health and education, because it's much easier for corrupt individuals to extract bribes or misappropriate resources when purchasing big military hardware, boats and planes and so forth, than it is when engaging in health or education spending. Similarly, pervasive corruption often leads to a distortion of spending in favor of big high technology items rather than basic, simple staples. So within healthcare spending, for example, when corruption is systemic, you're more likely to see ministries of health or hospitals purchasing extremely expensive health technology much of which only benefits a relatively small number of people, and not spending nearly enough on things like bandages and basic medicines, because it's much more difficult to extract corrupt wealth from those sorts of transactions. You also see in this area too much spending in the infrastructure context on new buildings and new roads and new projects, and not nearly enough spending on operation and maintenance for existing infrastructure. So politicians and others like to build big new bridges because that's an opportunity to extract illicit resources. They don't have that much interest, when corruption is pervasive, in making sure those bridges don't fall down after they're built. Okay? Corruption also undermines the effectiveness of regulations that are designed to protect vulnerable people. So environmental regulations can be undermined or avoided by corrupt businesses. The protection of the natural environment from, let's say, illegal logging or illegal mining can be undermined by corruption. That, I know from recent engagement I've had with people in Brazil, I understand is a very significant problem in this country, especially in the Amazonian rainforest, where illegal logging operations and illegal mining operations persist and result in significant environmental degradation. And the reason they persist is because they're able to corrupt the local institutions of justice. Corruption undermines programs that are intended to help the poorest and most vulnerable people in society. Corruption, in fact, is the most significant contributor to earthquake deaths around the world. That might seem strange. How can corruption kill people in earthquakes? The reason is that the people who die in earthquakes, very few of them are killed by the actual earthquake. Almost all those who die in earthquakes die because the buildings they're in collapse. And in many of those situations, most of those situations, the reasons the buildings collapse is they were not built according to the regulations that were supposed to be followed by the builders to make them withstand a significant earthquake. And the reason that happens is because of bribes paid to the public officials who are supposed to ensure that the builders are following the regulations. And one more point I'll mention, and it's a point that General Dodge emphasized repeatedly in her remarks. Corruption undermines confidence and trust in the government, which can have a range of bad consequences. It can undermine confidence in democracy generally. It can also contribute to violent extremism. It can contribute to public health crises. In Liberia, in Africa, during the Ebola crisis from several years ago, that crisis was worsened by corruption, not only because crucial medicines were often stolen or misappropriated, but also when the population was getting instructions from the public health ministry about what to do to prevent the spread of the disease, many people ignored it because they were so used to believing that the ministry was corrupt that it didn't have any credibility with the population. So all of these problems mean that corruption is incredibly significant, and I'm glad that several of the previous speakers emphasized that it's not a crime that doesn't have victims. It can be as significant in its consequences for human life, safety, and security as what we might think of as more traditional violent crimes. So it's a problem that we need to address. But as I said a moment ago, it's a problem that in some societies is pervasive, and it can seem like it's a problem that's impossible to address, or so it seems. I'm going to actually emphasize in a moment that I don't think corruption, systemic corruption, is as impossible to address as it sometimes seems. But it certainly appears to be the case that in many societies, corruption is this intractable problem. And one of the reasons that this is so is that corruption is one of these phenomena that can be self-reinforcing. That is, corruption itself creates the conditions in which corruption is more likely. Corruption feeds on itself, creating a vicious circle that can be very difficult to escape. There are a number of different mechanisms that can give corruption this kind of self-perpetuating or self-reinforcing vicious circle effect. One of those mechanisms is economic. If it is true, as I suggested a moment ago, that corruption holds the economy back, that societies where corruption is pervasive are poorer than societies where corruption is under control, that means the society will have fewer resources at its disposal to address corruption. There are good reasons to suppose, and there's research to support the idea, that it is easier to control corruption in wealthier societies. You have that fighting corruption requires resources, and that as people's incomes rise and they're not worried only about where their next meal is coming from, they pay more attention to how their governments are operating. But this creates a problem where corruption may keep countries poor and poverty may prevent countries from taking the actions that are necessary to address corruption. That's one mechanism through which corruption can be self-sustaining or self-reinforcing, but there are others as well. One has to do with the resources available for law enforcement and the deterrent effect the threat of prosecution and punishment may have on the corrupt. Here the idea is that when corruption is pervasive, when a lot of people are engaged in corrupt acts, the probability that any one of them will be caught and punished is relatively lower. Whereas when corruption is relatively rarer, engaging in corrupt acts is riskier because the probability of getting caught and punished is higher. Now, that might have not been completely clear to everyone. Let me try to illustrate it with an example, not from the corruption context, but it'll carry over very easily. Think about speeding on the highway. Imagine that you have only a limited number of police officers, and they can only pull over and give a ticket to, let's say in any given hour, 10 people who are speeding on a particular highway. So if in that hour, 1,000 people are speeding on that highway, right, the probability that any one of them will get pulled over is only 1%, very low. All of them knowing this have an incentive to speed, even though 10 of them will get caught. On the other hand, if only 20 people are speeding on the highway, then all of those 20 know there's about a 50% chance they're going to get caught and punished. So, and this might resonate with those of you in the room who are prosecutors or investigators, when your resources are limited, there are only so many potential defendants who you'll actually be able to catch. And if there's a huge number of them, you're not going to be able to deter them all that effectively, because even if you're putting forth your best efforts, the denominator of that fraction is just so big. On the other hand, when the problem is more under control, the same amount of resources devoted to enforcement and prosecution has a much higher deterrent effect because the number of potential targets is smaller. Here's another mechanism through which corruption can be self-perpetuating, and one I think that may have some resonance here in Brazil, especially given the point that General Dodge was making about the relationship between corruption and organized crime. One of the ways that the corrupt or organized criminal networks are able to carry on with their illegal activities is by corrupting the institutions of justice, by corrupting the police or potentially law prosecutors or judges. The resources that are used to corrupt the institutions of justice are produced by those illegal activities. So in other words, organized criminal activities, again, something like illegal logging or illegal mining or drug trafficking or what have you, produces profits that are used to corrupt the institutions of justice. That corruption of the institutions of justice creates the impunity where those corrupt actors are allowed to continue to pursue their illegal economic activities. You can't operate an illegal gold mine in the Amazon without corrupting the institutions of justice. You can't hide a gold mine. It's there. Everyone can see it if they look. But what happens is these people make so much money from the illegal gold mining, they can use that money to pay off the police or other enforcers so that nobody stops them. So again, you get this reciprocal relationship. Impunity leads to illicit wealth, which is used to purchase impunity. Let me give you yet another example that I think is especially important in the context of corruption, and that has to do with what social scientists will sometimes refer to as social norms. Feelings of shame or guilt associated with conduct that is against the rules. And here the important point to keep in mind is that although prosecution, punishment, sanctions, all of these things are really important, for most of us, I think it's fair to say, in our day-to-day lives, the reason that we follow certain rules, that we don't engage in certain unethical behaviors, is not primarily because we're afraid of getting caught and punished, but because of our internal sense of what is right and what is wrong. And most of us aren't saints, but most of us like to think of ourselves as basically good people. and we don't want to do things that create a tension, a dissonance between our images of ourselves as basically good people and the conduct that we're engaged in. So when a certain form of technically illegal conduct is very widespread, the shame or guilt that we feel when we engage in that conduct goes down. If everybody in the office is taking bribes, then I might not feel that guilty about taking a bribe. If nobody else engages in that behavior, then I might feel that this behavior is really out of line. It's something that is just not done. And these beliefs can become self-reinforcing. People behave the way they think they're supposed to behave in that context, the way everybody else is behaving, even if it's technically not the official behavior that everyone is supposed to be following. And again, I assume this will resonate with many of you. We have this experience all the time in our day-to-day lives, including in contexts that have nothing to do with corruption or even in the context of behavior that's necessarily bad behavior. So I'll give you one that's been on my mind a little bit since I've gotten to Brazil. So all of my Brazilian friends have explained to me that in Brazil, things don't start on time, right? That if it says 9 a.m., doesn't really mean 9 a.m. If someone says we're going to meet for dinner at 8, it's more like 9, 9:30, and so forth. Why is this? This is kind of a silly example, but I want to really illustrate it. And what's going on here? Well, if everybody kind of knows that 8 p.m. really means 9 or 9:30, then you won't show up at 8 p.m. because no one else is going to do so. And no one will be particularly upset if someone shows up an hour or an hour and a half late, because that's just like the way things are done. Right? And this also means that even if people don't particularly like this, right, even if people feel like it would really be better if everyone showed up on time and things started on time, it's very difficult for one person by him or herself to change the norm, right? Because it's what everyone else is doing. And again, I'm using this as kind of a silly example, and it's certainly actually not meant to be one, and I hope I wasn't misinterpreted. This is not one that's critical of Brazilians, right? But once these norms get established, they become entrenched, then it just feeds into the way that we're expected to behave. So, and these things can differ across countries or cultures. If you're in Germany and you say, meet me at 6, and the person doesn't show up until 7:30, you'd be kind of upset because the expectations are different. So these things can become self-reinforcing and very difficult to shift. One more that I want to emphasize, and I think this is important and not sufficiently appreciated in terms of how corruption can be self-reinforcing, has to do with the selection of people into or out of politics or civil service. And the point I want to emphasize is this. One of the most important things about any institution is the people who are in that institution. What kind of people are attracted to particular kinds of jobs? In some countries, the civil service has a reputation for being very corrupt. Or sometimes individual departments or ministries have a reputation of being very corrupt. The people in them are not very hardworking, and they're more interested in making money for themselves by taking bribes or extracting resources or so forth. What kind of person, what kind of young, ambitious person is likely to want to join such a ministry or department? Well, those people who are ambitious, hardworking, honest, patriotic, really want to serve their country are not likely to want to join an institution or an office that has a reputation for dishonest behavior or laziness or inefficiency. The kinds of people who would be interested in joining such an office or department are the people who don't want to work very hard but want to make money. On the flip side, if you have an office or department that has a reputation for integrity, high standards, and dedication to public service, the lazy and corrupt are not going to want to be part of that office or ministry, whereas young people coming out of their education who maybe aren't, where money is not the most important thing to them, they really want to serve their country, they will be more attracted to those organizations. And again, I hope it's straightforward how this creates these potentially vicious cycles or virtuous cycles, where once an organization or an entity or department has a reputation for integrity, it will attract people who will perpetuate that reputation for integrity, whereas an organization or a department that has a reputation for corruption will attract people who will perpetuate that reputation for corruption. There are many other mechanisms that I could go through. I won't go through all of them. I've highlighted some of the most important, but I really do want to emphasize this fundamental aspect of corruption, systemic corruption, that it feeds on itself. And it's one of the reasons it can make it seem so impossible to change things. Because people who live in these systems, even if they don't like them, feel like, well, what can we do? We're just stuck. This is a problem that feeds on itself. It's entrenched. And so some people do look at this problem and say, basically, once a society gets stuck in a situation of systemic corruption, there's nothing one can do about it, or the only thing you can do about it is to hope you can have some major revolution, a big bang, it's sometimes called, or a big push that radically changes many things about the society all at once. But that's not true. At least it's not generally true. In fact, we have lots of examples of countries that have managed to move from a situation of high corruption or systemic corruption to a situation of more limited corruption, aberrational corruption. There are some of the success stories that people like to point to are modern examples like Singapore or Hong Kong or Rwanda or the Republic of Georgia. But while those success stories are important, they're actually not the ones that I mainly had in mind. What I want to emphasize, and I think this is a point that one can't emphasize enough, that if you look around the world today at those countries that are perceived as having corruption under control, that get really good scores on things like the Corruption Perceptions Index of Transparency International. Countries like Sweden, Finland, Denmark, the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Germany, etc. All of those countries, what it's important to understand is all of those countries were, at some point in their history, afflicted with pervasive, widespread systemic corruption. And it's really important to keep in mind. If you looked at the United States in the 19th century, especially at the state and local level, although to some extent at the national level as well, you would see systemic corruption, widespread systemic corruption, very much resembling and comparable to what you might see in a country like Brazil or India or any number of other places. If you look at Sweden at the beginning of the 19th century, the Swedish state is thoroughly corrupt. If you look at Finland in the same period, if you look at Denmark 200, 250, 300 years ago, if you look across the world, what you will find is that through most of human history, systemic corruption is the norm, not the exception. That's the way most human societies have been governed through most of our history. Now, one could take that information and say that's really depressing, that most human societies for most of history have been characterized by systemic corruption. But to me, I think we should take that as at least somewhat encouraging news. Because if other societies have managed to effect this transition, then that means that societies today, where people feel like this problem is so entrenched nothing can be done about it, those societies too can go through a similar kind of transition. And what we see when we do look historically at what happened in countries like my home country, the United States, or countries like Sweden, in making this transition from systemic corruption to a system where corruption, though always a problem, was more under control, is that it took quite a bit of time. But what was really important was the gradual accumulation of reforms and a commitment to continuing to move forward, to push ahead with reforms that gradually improve things, that built on one another, until eventually you got to a point where there really was a quite dramatic transition. So that's, I guess, one of the most important points I want to emphasize in my remarks today. And I do want to emphasize it because in my conversations with people from your country about Brazil's corruption problem, one thing that I've heard enough that it makes me a little bit worried is people saying things like, it's just in the Brazilian character, or corruption is so deeply entrenched in our culture, or we just inherited this from the Portuguese and there's nothing we can do about it. And I think that's wrong. I really think that's wrong in a very fundamental sense. And it does not, and saying that it's wrong does not deny that corruption does have this self-reinforcing, self-perpetuating property. I think that's true. I definitely think it's true that a country like Brazil can find itself stuck in this vicious cycle where corruption is self-reinforcing. But that's not because of some deep feature of the Brazilian character or some immutable characteristic that can't be altered, because if you were to go to a major American city in 1850, you might well think corruption is so deeply rooted, so deeply entrenched in the culture here, there's nothing that could ever possibly be done about it, and that turned out to be wrong. So what can be done about corruption? What sorts of measures could be adopted? Well, there's a lot of things one could talk about. There's no way I could get through everything. But since I'm a law professor and this is a group of mostly legal professionals, maybe I'll say just a little bit particularly about the agenda for legal or legal institutional reform. The starting place, obviously, is to have strong anti-corruption laws on the books, but everyone agrees they're not enough. Virtually all countries, including those countries where corruption is pervasive or systemic, have on their statute books laws against bribery, laws against embezzlement, laws against nepotism, and they're not always terribly effective. So obviously, one thing you need to do is to make sure your laws are enforced effectively. But there are other types of substantive changes to anti-corruption law that may be particularly important. So one thing I did want to highlight that General Dodge emphasized in her remarks is that in addition to going after the people, which is really important, going after the money is really important as well. So making sure that the legal system, that the laws in the books have adequate mechanisms to seize assets, including assets that are held abroad, may be really, really important. Some countries, including the United Kingdom, are really pushing the envelope on this. The United Kingdom has a new legal mechanism that they call unexplained wealth orders that not only provides a mechanism for seizing wealth believed to be the product of crime or corruption, but contains a burden-shifting element where if the assets held by the target seem excessive in relation to the legal sources of income, the burden of proof can shift to the holder of those assets to prove their legal origin in order to allow the government to seize them. Again, the UK is maybe on the leading edge of this, but I think many people who fight corruption agree that in general, some kind of robust, effective mechanism to seize assets is important. Another aspect of substantive law that's very important is to make sure that the laws are effective not only against the people who engage in corruption themselves, but that there's effective legal regulation of the intermediaries, the bankers, the lawyers, the accountants, and so forth, whose cooperation is often essential to, for example, produce the kinds of money laundering schemes that are necessary to facilitate grand corruption. Another point that I know is of interest in Brazil, was discussed in this morning's remarks and will be discussed later on in the conference, has to do with reforms to procedural law. So it's not just about the substantive laws against corrupt acts like bribery or embezzlement, but it also has to do with the system, the law of criminal procedure, for example, possibly the law of civil procedure as well, that make it possible to effectively go after those who engage in acts of corruption. And of course, there's a difficult balance that one needs to strike here that all liberal democratic societies struggle with, which is to make sure that there are adequate procedural protections in place to safeguard fairness and the basic rights of defendants, while at the same time not making it too easy for certain defendants, especially those who are very wealthy and can hire the best lawyers, to exploit those procedural protections in ways that give them essentially a kind of impunity or immunity from effective prosecution. One other thing here that I think is really important, which I don't think has yet come up in our conversation today, but maybe a topic of conversation later in the conference, has to do with the protection and encouragement of whistleblowers. So I'm actually not sure if whistleblower translates into Portuguese. I know different countries use different terminology for this, but as I'm sure all of you in this room, especially those of you who are prosecutors, are well aware, it's very difficult to get the information that you need on sophisticated criminal schemes without some inside information from someone who's involved in those schemes. Sometimes the way you get it is you manage to catch one of them, someone who was careless, and again, there's been much discussion of plea bargaining, and to use your leverage over that person to get information on others. But another really critical way to get information on these schemes is by people who are part of these schemes or are close enough to them to understand what's going on, who voluntarily come forward to the government and say, I have some information that there's a scheme of corruption or financial fraud or money laundering or what have you. So whistleblowers are essential to effective anti-corruption enforcement and enforcement of other laws against fraud and organized crime, especially in the corporate sector. But from the whistleblower's perspective, going to the government with that kind of information is incredibly risky. In some circumstances, it may put your life at risk. But even when that's not an issue, you may be jeopardizing your career. You may be incurring substantial personal risks. So if you want whistleblowers to come forward, you need to first absolutely promise them credibly adequate protections for their lives and physical safety, sometimes to guarantee their anonymity, if that's possible. But beyond that, many countries, including my home country, have started to move in the direction of creating stronger monetary incentives for whistleblowers to come forward. So in the United States, under a recent provision of a law that was adopted some years back in the wake of these massive financial frauds that caused so much damage to both the US economy and the global economy, there was a provision inserted that said, if someone comes to the Securities and Exchange Commission, our regulator of securities markets, with original material evidence that indicates that there's been some violation of securities laws, and as a result of that information, the SEC recovers fines in excess of $1 million, somewhere between 10 and 30% of the recovery will go to the whistleblower. So a whistleblower who issues a report and that report results in a $100 million fine would receive somewhere between $10 million and $30 million. And many people find this distasteful or suspicious, especially because often the whistleblowers were themselves involved to some degree in the illegal activity, and paying people that much money may make some uncomfortable. But I think there's a good deal of evidence that this is extremely effective in encouraging whistleblowers to come forward, and the hope is that it will create a sufficient deterrent effect that in fact you won't need to be paying whistleblowers that much, because in any large corruption scheme, if every member of the scheme knows that any person, if they so choose, can go to the government and blow the whistle on the scheme and would receive a substantial financial payout, it may make them more nervous about entering into or about creating the schemes in the first place. Institutional autonomy for prosecutors and judges, absolutely critical. I don't need to say much about that to this audience. General Dodge was talking about how in the Brazilian system, the 1988 reforms gave the public prosecutor substantially more autonomy from the rest of the executive branch. And my Brazilian friends tell me that that reform was crucial in ensuring that we would see the kinds of anti-corruption prosecutions in Brazil we are now seeing. In the United States, we don't have that, but many people believe that the fact that, like Brazil, we have a two-tiered federalist system with both federal prosecutors and judges and state prosecutors and judges was absolutely critical in breaking the networks of systemic corruption at the state and local level. Because even though the state political machines may have captured the institutions of justice, including prosecutors and judges in the state, the fact that federal prosecutors from outside the system could bring cases in federal court was crucial in breaking the power of those machines. At the federal level, the United States, again, does not have the same kind of autonomy that we see in the Brazilian prosecution service. There's much more reliance on informal norms of prosecutorial independence, which, as those of you who follow news from my country may be aware, are norms that are currently being tested, as we have a special prosecutor who is investigating the President of the United States and his close associates. That special prosecutor has some statutory protections, but does not have the same kind of strong protections that your prosecution service has in Brazil. And from day to day, we are watching to see whether those strong informal norms of prosecutorial independence will hold up. There's also a range of reforms that are related to transparency that are really important in moving forward in the fight against systemic corruption. So one aspect of this transparency is transparency regarding government officials' assets and incomes made publicly available. So I should have checked, I'm not sure what the current state of Brazilian law is on this, but many countries now require asset and income declarations. Some countries have those declarations made to the government, but they're kept confidential. In other contexts, these declarations are public, and any member of the public can go online and look at the asset and income declarations. This is extremely important, and I think the evidence suggests that the public declarations are much more effective than declarations simply to the government. Another kind of transparency that very much needs to be on the agenda is corporate transparency, especially transparency with respect to the owners of companies. We've seen a lot of evidence over the last several years that many of the most important and devastating grand corruption schemes, as well as other kinds of organized criminal activity, including drug trafficking and human trafficking and other kinds of wrongdoing, have made use of corporate anonymity, anonymous shell companies registered in various jurisdictions where one company owns another, and you can never figure out the actual human beings who own these companies. So there's been some movement on this recently. I regret to say the United States is a laggard on this. I'm hopeful that in the next Congress we'll finally pass this pending bill on anonymous company reform. The UK, again, has been maybe out in front on this, having recently adopted a law that requires those who register companies in the United Kingdom to provide and verify information on the true owners of the company. And the UK Parliament recently made the controversial, but in my view quite important decision to extend that requirement to the British overseas territories, including places like the British Virgin Islands, where many of these shell companies exist. So that kind of transparency is, I think, hugely important. Just one or two other things I want to say about the kinds of legal reforms that may be really crucial in getting corruption under control, even though they don't necessarily seem like corruption specifically. And I want to really pick up on and re-emphasize something that Justice Fuchs said in his remarks and that General Dodge touched on as well, and that's the importance of robust media and civil society to provide the reporting and oversight that's often crucial to exposing corrupt schemes. Now, there are countries that have done a very good job in combating systemic corruption without a terribly free media or open space for civil society. Singapore is maybe the lead example here. But the research across countries strongly suggests that cases like that are exceptional, and that in most cases, a robust civil society with few legal limits on citizens' ability to organize in groups and operate, including with foreign collaboration or support, and an independent media that's not threatened with, for example, crippling monetary liability from overly plaintiff-friendly defamation laws, is critical to keeping corruption under control. So even though people don't always think of things like press freedom laws as anti-corruption laws, or right to association laws as anti-corruption laws, really at some fundamental level they are. There are other things as well, but we need to think about making sure the strengthening of those laws, the defense of those laws, as much a part of the anti-corruption agenda as our laws against bribery and embezzlement. Two more points I want to make here before moving to the fourth and final section of my talk. The law on elections and political parties is clearly an important element of the fight against corruption as well. In order to succeed in the fight against corruption, it must be possible to run and win an election campaign legally. If there's a situation in which it is simply infeasible to achieve political power without engaging in corrupt activity, then, and here I'm drawing on the point that I made a little bit earlier in my talk, who are the politicians going to be? They're going to be the people who cheated. How likely are they to want to clean up the system? Not very likely, because they're the ones who benefited from it. So here again, I want to be very careful not to say anything specific about Brazil. I don't know nearly enough about Brazil's system of election laws or your law on political parties to know either what your situation is or what you should do about it. The only point I want to make here is that, as with the point I just made about media freedom laws, laws on political parties, campaign finance, and electoral competition need to be thought of as, among other things, anti-corruption laws, and analyzed with respect to, among other things, their effect on corruption and the incentives to engage in corruption. The last point I want to make here before turning to the final topic is, I said a moment ago that Samuel Huntington's claim that corruption could be this efficient grease because it would allow people to get around cumbersome, burdensome, overly rigid regulations. I said that was mostly wrong, But I do want to emphasize there is a kernel of truth to the argument, which is that when you get a situation where it is too difficult to engage in productive economic activity lawfully because there are too many regulations and they're too expensive, that does create a situation where corruption is more likely. Where if you want to start a business lawfully and follow all the rules and go through all the steps, you're going to be at a huge competitive disadvantage relative to other economic actors who are willing to pay bribes. Well, just like with the politicians, who's going to succeed in economic competition if complying with the official rules is going to basically put you out of business, right? It's going to be those people who paid bribes. And that means one needs to think about reform of the regulatory system as also part of the anti-corruption agenda, to make sure that we haven't designed a regulatory system that is so burdensome that the only way people are going to be able to operate effectively and to succeed economically is to bend or break the rules. I do want to make sure I emphasize, though, that point is very different from the point that one often hears in conversations about the relationship between government regulation and corruption, the claim that big government is more likely to be more corrupt. So this is a claim that is out there in the world. Many people, many distinguished people have argued that to reduce corruption, one must reduce the size of government. I believe the Nobel laureate economist Gary Becker wrote an op-ed once to this effect with the title something like, to boot out corruption, boot out big government. So that's wrong. I'm fairly confident that's wrong. If you look at internationally, the relationship between government size as measured by government spending as a percentage of gross domestic product, and at least perceived corruption, it appears to be the case that even when controlling for a range of other factors, countries with larger governments have less corruption, or at least are perceived as having less corruption. And if you pause for a moment, this shouldn't actually be that surprising. If you think about the countries that do the best on things like the Transparency International Index, they're largely places like Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Germany, the Nordic countries or Northwestern European countries that have very large governments, even relative to their general wealth. Whereas if we think about some of the places in the world with the highest levels of perceived corruption, many places in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, those places actually have very small governments as measured by total government spending, taxation spending, and so forth. It appears, I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think there's evidence to support this that indicates that you tend to get a lot of corruption when you have governments that regulate a lot, they have a lot of rules that you have to follow, but actually are relatively small in terms of how much they do in the economy. That would be a place, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa fit that description. You have to go through 30 different steps if you want to start a legal business, but the government does very little taxation and very little spending on public goods. Whereas those countries that tend to be perceived as having lower corruption, places like the Scandinavian countries, tend to have a lighter regulatory touch, but actually quite large governments in terms of the overall role of the government in the society. All right, so that's just a quick summary of some of the tools that we might want to see in the anti-corruption toolkit. But really, for an audience of Brazilians, I don't think I need to dwell too much on the issue of tools and toolkits. I've tried to emphasize some things that I think are important to think about. But Brazil, if anything, at least among developing countries, is I think at the leading edge of the development of specific proposals, specific tools that could be used to combat corruption. I'm thinking in particular of the so-called 10 measures against corruption that were developed some years ago and have now been upgraded by or replaced by the new measures against corruption, of which there are dozens. So I haven't analyzed those specifically. I'm not necessarily endorsing the entire list. I'm sure many people could reasonably disagree about this item or that item. I guess what I want to say is that seems to me like a very useful starting point in terms of tools in the anti-corruption toolkit. And that toolkit is important, but it's not the most important thing in my view. In my view, the real reason most countries where systemic corruption is a huge problem haven't managed to get it under control is not because people don't know what to do. I think the problem is not really that people just have no idea what mechanisms would be helpful in reducing systemic corruption. There may be some new innovative ideas that people haven't thought of before that would be hugely helpful, but I'm going to guess that roughly 75 to 80% of the toolkit are things that are pretty obvious and that we already know. effective laws vigorously enforced by institutions that have high integrity and sufficient autonomy, regular audits of government programs, and so on and so forth. That's not the real reason. The real reason, in my view, the main reason that countries where corruption is pervasive haven't been able to get it under control has to do with politics, has to do with actually implementing these measures that could make some progress. Again, to use a kind of silly metaphor, and again, I hope no one thinks of me as making light of this very serious problem, but it's one that I think, for me, aptly captures this basic problem. I'll talk about another problem that I have and other people have, and that's, especially as we get older, not getting too fat. Right? So a lot of people in my country are worried about they want to lose weight. And there's a whole industry, at least in the United States, of people offering every year new diet books with new exciting diets, like this is the way you lose weight. So the paleo diet and the South Beach diet and the Mediterranean diet and the zone diet, like on and on and on. But the reason people like me can't keep our weight down to where we want it is not because like we haven't figured out what we're supposed to do. I mean, everyone kind of knows what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to eat a healthy, balanced diet with lots of fruits and vegetables and not too much fat or sugar, right? Like, I know that. The reason we have trouble doing this is because actually sticking to it over the long term turns out to be really challenging, right? So the real challenge we need to face is not can we get an even better diet, an even better nutritional plan. It's how can we stick to one and implement it so that it actually works. As with weight loss, so too with corruption. How can we deal with this problem? And I think with corruption, it's even more challenging. It's an even bigger problem. Because although people will make general references that create an analogy to a polity, a society's fight against corruption and an individual's willingness to do something like diet, they use this metaphor of willpower and talk about political will. I think that's a little bit fuzzy. I think just talking generally about political will is not that helpful. It creates the impression that if only we wanted it enough, if only we tried hard enough, then somehow it would happen. But I think it's important that we need to think more specifically about what are the circumstances that create a political possibility to take significant action against corruption in the face of what I'll describe as, I think, a fundamental problem in this area. And the fundamental problem is this. Those with the power to change a system are usually those who benefit from the system as it exists. Those with the strongest incentive to change a system are usually those who lack the power to change that system. So how do we create a situation in which the people with the power to change the system, who are usually the people who benefit from that system as it exists, be willing to push forward with reforms that might not benefit them, right? that would create changes that would work against their personal interests. Here, I think our understanding and what we can draw from academic research is much less clear than what we know about either the harms of corruption or the kinds of legal or institutional reform measures that would help reduce it. I feel like my community, the community of academics, has not yet done a good enough job in better understanding the conditions that can produce the political circumstances that will help us take action against corruption. That said, let me conclude my talk by outlining what I'll call 4 models of anti-corruption reform or political economy of anti-corruption reform that we've seen in different countries, and I'll say a little bit about each one of them. So the first model, call this the powerful and enlightened leader model. One way that some countries have gotten around this problem, where the people with the power to change the system often are the ones who don't really have an incentive, is that in some circumstances you get a leader who is both public-spirited and far-sighted enough, and maybe concerned enough with his or her reputation or legacy and history, to feel like I really want to change the system, and that person has a lot of power concentrated in herself or her office, not a lot of checks and balances, and can just push through a lot of change unilaterally, even over the objection of the existing elite. The best example of this kind of reform is probably Singapore or Hong Kong. Singapore and Hong Kong in the 1960s, 1970s. And I think that's quite an attractive model in many parts of the world. When I was traveling last year in Indonesia, I spoke to a number of Indonesian students, researchers, lawyers, and others who expressed they expressed great frustration with the failure of Indonesian democracy to effectively tackle corruption, and said that what we really need is just a strong leader, someone like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. It was odd to me because, of course, Indonesia had experience, fairly recent experience, with a very powerful leader with few checks on his power. That would be Suharto, previous to the 1997 democratic reforms, and corruption was a disaster under the Suharto regime. And that actually really highlights why I think one of the reasons I think this is such a dangerous, though perhaps dangerously seductive approach to breaking the logjam around corruption. If you concentrate a lot of power in a single leader or in the executive branch generally, this might be a good thing if you've got a leader who has the right views and who's public-spirited and far-sighted. But if you have a leader who is corrupt or incompetent or otherwise dangerous, this is a disaster. Right? If you put all power in the king, this is great if you have a good king. If you have a bad king, it's a tragedy. And it's very difficult to predict in advance whether it'll have a good or a bad king. The other reason I think this model for getting corruption under control is worrisome, despite some apparent success stories like Singapore and Hong Kong, is that in my view, longer-term success against corruption requires the building and strengthening of institutions that last longer than any individual leader. And although it's not always the case that very powerful leaders are not interested in building institutions for the long term, that is often the case. So I would worry about jumping too quickly to the conclusion that when corruption is systemic, the only thing we can do, or the best thing we can do, is to try to follow the Singapore model of finding our Lee Kuan Yew and giving that person the power to act unilaterally. A second model for how we can get successful anti-corruption reform despite this fundamental political problem is the crisis, is the moment of crisis or disruption to the status quo that enables people to take action quickly, where the old elites are being swept away, the new elites are emerging, no one as yet has figured out exactly what's going to happen, and it's a time when you can get a lot of change. I just mentioned Indonesia. I think Indonesia in the late 1990s may be an example of exactly this. When the old regime, the Suharto regime, collapsed, it was a moment of great opportunity to do a bunch of things that couldn't have been done otherwise. I suspect, though I do not know enough about Brazilian history, that Brazil in the mid-1980s, after the transition from the dictatorship, may have been another example of something like this. It was a moment when institutional reform became possible, precisely because there was a moment of great disruption. Now, the difficulty, of course, with this example is that if you're right now in Brazil and you want substantial institutional reforms, A, you don't never know when a major crisis is going to come along, and B, you may not want a major crisis. It may be very destructive. It's not necessarily like we should provoke such a thing. So as a political strategy, saying, well, we'll just wait for a crisis to occur may not be the most helpful advice. But I do think there is an important lesson to be drawn from examples like Indonesia in the 1990s. And again, I'm not sure if I should use the Brazilian example because I don't know enough about the history, but other countries in that situation. And that's that, as the English language saying goes, fortune favors the prepared. Right? You never know, if you're an anti-corruption reformer, when you're going to get your opportunity. You never know when there's going to be that moment of disruption where people are going to be looking around saying, the world is changing, what should we do? So it counsels not giving up, even if it seems like right now you're developing proposals and an agenda and everyone is ignoring you. Keep working on that because you never know when the moment will come, and when the moment does come, you may need to act very, very quickly. You may not to say, oh wait, we just had a crisis, the political system is changing, give us 10 years to develop a useful agenda for reform. Right? Develop it now, because you never know when that moment of crisis will come, and those who are most prepared to advocate persuasively for the kinds of legal and institutional changes that would be most beneficial will be most likely to have an influence. A third approach to dealing with this fundamental political problem that those who are most likely to, or those who are in the position to change society may not have so much interest in doing so, is what we might think of as the Trojan horse strategy. Right? That is, sometimes certain reforms have important implications for constraining corruption that are not obvious for the political elite, or that have longer term consequences that won't necessarily have major negative consequences for the people currently in power. So sometimes it may make sense, if you're working on fighting for anti-corruption, maybe not to be quite so obvious about how and why the reforms you're proposing will result in fewer corruption opportunities. I'm not saying lie, but again, if you jump up and down and say, if we pass this, then people will not be able to exploit their public positions for private gain, you might lose rather than gain political support. Might also mean that under some circumstances it makes sense to craft reforms that really do have more of a medium or long-term impact, making them less objectionable to people who are in power right now. So again, that approach can work in some areas, but I do think the application is limited. And that brings me to the fourth and final model that I want to emphasize. And this model emphasizes the importance of pressure from below. Citizens and civil society groups who demand significant reform, changing the calculus of those in power. This may seem fairly obvious, but I think it's really important. I think that, again, I am skeptical of relying too much on a single strong leader. I'm a believer in things like checks and balances. I think that taking advantage of moments of opportunity is great when they happen, but they don't happen that often. I think that sometimes being a little bit subtle about how you're pushing anti-corruption reform can be helpful, but again, that approach may have limited application. I think that for the most part, most of our examples of successful transitions from systemic corruption to corruption that's under control, at least if we limit our investigation to democratic societies, have involved long-term, relatively broad-based movements spearheaded by civil society groups. And that, I think, is really crucial. Those movements need to be built and sustained over time. They need to keep the issue of corruption as a high-profile political issue. They need to make politicians feel like they have no choice but to at least attempt to reform the system to address this problem, or they're going to lose political support. I guess I'll just say one thing that's maybe a little bit parochial, but as someone who teaches in a university, I do feel like universities, especially elite universities, have an important role to play here, because the people who graduate from my institution, and I'm sure this is true of the people who graduate from the Brazilian institutions where many of you got your degrees, are on their way to the elite of society. They're going to be the people who benefit from the system. And so I do view the university, including, in addition to its other missions, as a place where we really do have a responsibility to inculcate that desire to change society and to make things better, so when our students go off and become members of the elites of our various countries, they retain those commitments. That's got to be part of it. It has to be many different sectors of society working together and keeping up the pressure. So I've talked for slightly longer than I meant to. I'm 3 minutes over 1 hour, so sorry about that. But let me just offer some very brief concluding thoughts. The first is that the fight against public corruption is important because effective government is important. That's really what we're talking about here. I mean, the reason that corruption is this problem that has all of these negative consequences all over is that I think there's a widespread consensus now that a healthy, just, productive society requires an effective government. And there will always be deep divisions of opinion about the right way to govern and the right policies to adopt. But at bottom, you need to have a government that's effective. If you don't have a government that's effective, everything else falls apart. And corruption undermines the effectiveness of corruption. Next thing I want to just emphasize is, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, the fight against corruption is never done. We'll never win. It's not a war where we will ever be able to declare victory and go home. It requires constant effort to keep the problem under control. And this is certainly true. I feel this very keenly because I feel like in the United States right now, we are at a moment where we need to be especially vigilant to make sure that norms that have been developed about proper behavior in public office are not eroded or violated outright. So citizens have to always maintain their commitment to fighting this problem and to holding their governments of high standards of ethics and integrity. And that's as true in the United States or Sweden or Denmark as it is in Brazil or India or South Africa. And tackling this problem effectively involves building bridges not only within countries but across countries. It also involves building bridges between academic researchers and practitioners, including policymakers, jurists, prosecutors, and others. And I hope that this lecture and the conversation we're about to have, both today and over the next several days, can contribute in some very small way to the building of precisely those bridges. So thank you very much for your indulgence in listening to me talk to you for over an hour, and I very much look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you very much.